This has been a very good year for painting in Boston. We've been lucky to have Amy Stillman's one Lump or Two at the ICA and at our own Boston University Art Gallery, Leidy Churchman's Lazy River, just two pieces of a larger picture. It's clear that we are in the midst of a renewed conversation about how the personal and the political come together in painting, how abstraction, history, feminism, and the sheer visual pleasure of painting fuse to form a space for new ideas in the 21st century. We're thrilled to contribute to that dialogue with tonight's lecture. Carrie Moyer is a painter and a writer. She attended Pratt Institute, the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and Bard College, with time in between working as a graphic designer. In 2011, she joined the art department at Hunter College as an associate professor. Her paintings meld hard graphic shapes with biomorphic forms in acrylic, simultaneously recalling Surrealism, 1970s counterculture graphics, and abstract expressionism. As much an activist as an artist, Moyer co-founded Dyke Action Machine in 1991 and has worked with and designed graphics for Queer Nation, the Lesbian Avengers, and the New York City Anti-Violence Project. Her writing has appeared in Art in America, Artforum, Modern Painters, the Brooklyn Rail, and other publications. She has been exhibited at PS1 MoMA, Cooper Hewitt, and the Tang Museums, just to name a few, and she has been the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships, including Creative Capital, Joan Mitchell Foundation, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Please join me in welcoming Carrie Moyer. Push it to 100%.
Right, okay. Hello, everyone. Sorry you had to live through the travails of me learning Keynote. So I'm going to actually take a different tack this time in terms of my lecture. I've lectured in Boston many times, and since it's something I do frequently, it's like, how do I mix it up for myself? So this time, just before we keep going, are people hearing like 12 echoes? No, okay, that's me. I'm hearing things, oh no. So this time I'm actually going to talk about the history of my paintings only. And for those of you who want to know about my activism, and there's plenty of it, and I will be discussing it in the context of the paintings, you can go online and look at those images. I think for me, this has been a very interesting experience because I've been pulling out all these images that I don't normally show. So here we go. You have to bear with me. So I'm going to be tracing my work backwards from the present, just to tell you a little bit about myself that might help in terms of what you're looking at. I grew up primarily in Oregon, and that figures a lot in the work in the sense that I was sort of surrounded by the countryside and thinking about nature in a sort of cosmic woo-woo sort of a way. Okay, next. The other way that this is going to be innovative for me and hopefully interesting for you is that I'm going to combine two other parts of my life. That is writing primarily about painters and sort of pulling that into my own orbit around my own work. As I was looking over my writings from the past 10 years or so, there's a kind of greatest hits of several people that I've written about a lot. Several of them are in this year's biennial. So if you're a painting fanatic such as myself, I hope you all go to the biennial because it's amazing this year. So some of the people I've written about a lot, and I'm going to sort of read excerpts from my writing in conjunction with my painting, are Rochelle Feinstein, Louise Fishman, Helen Frankenthaler, Stephen Mueller, and Donna Nelson, Pat Steer, and Jack Whitten. So this sort of forms a constellation around what I'm doing and thinking about. And what you'll notice, first of all, about most of those people is they're abstract artists. So the first couple of images I'm going to show you are the latest work I've done. I spent 2 months this fall at McDowell in New Hampshire, painting in this amazing barn, with 8 large paintings up at one time. Nothing like my minute studio in Brooklyn. And as I was putting this together, I was thinking about one of the main influences on my work has been this painter named Stephen Mueller. I'm not going to show any of this work as I did with the studio visits with the grad students today. It's like I'm going to throw out a lot of names and hope that you look them up. One of the things that I'm really involved with my work and my teaching and writing is making these connections between painters and histories. So using those, this kind of net to create something that's particular to yourself. So, thinking about history and who you're in dialogue with, both from the past and into the future. This is something that I wrote about Stephen. Oddly, a lot of the things I wrote about these handful of people pertain to my own work too, as you will see. Stephen Mueller seemed intent on making sure that his viewers left the gallery in a state of optical bliss. Mueller, who has shown regularly since the 70s, is known for paintings that combine a palpable sense of light with varying sets of enigmatic shapes. Dazzling spatial effects created by placing static, opaque silhouettes over ambient stained grounds are among the wonderments of his work. So my process is mainly involves going back and forth between the canvas and the floor where things get stained. And I'm going to show you another painting. This one, Gertrude Jekyll's Jam. Gertrude Jekyll was a very, very well-known American garden designer from the turn of the century. And I sort of thought of this very particular painting, peculiar actually is the word I would use, as this kind of sort of uptight field painting made on acid or something. It's like every axis has been accounted for. To continue on with the quote about Mueller, Mueller continues to mine the dialectic of flat color and atmospheric light, but an aura of exotic inscrutability has been replaced with the heightened sense of exuberance and clarity. More than ever, Mueller uses underlying white surfaces of the canvas to create his light, controlling the luminosity of color through methodical gradated washes of transparent paint instead of free-form staining. The glowing, trippy space in these pictures brings to mind airbrushed or screen-printed psychedelia, even though it is painted by hand. So it's kind of been frightening the past couple of days looking back at these reviews. It's like, wait a minute, whose work am I talking about here? And perhaps that's why, or obviously that's why I've so responded to Stephen's work. A really critical part of my practice, which has gone on since the late 2000, or the late, like 1998, what is that, 1990s, is thinking about the unprimed or raw canvas as a light source in these paintings. So in this one, you can see this thing that sort of emanates from behind. This is many, many layers of paint mixed up with graphite pencil. Part of the work has been an interest in how symmetry functions. And I trace that back to both the sort of imperatives of graphic design, like how do we hold somebody in the middle of a picture? You know, do you use a cross? Do you use a sort of icon painting? Without having them sort of feel that the story goes away. So this idea about symmetry and being a reflection of the body is something that I've played with on and off for maybe the last 15 or 20 years. These last couple paintings that you've seen are very large, about 7 or 8 feet tall, actually. So again, this is something that a lot of staining and spattering and sort of spraying, these kind of cliches of painterliness show up in the painting and then sort of keep getting resubmerged in this graphic context. The thing that really drives my work, and it took me a long time to realize this, was not sitting down and thinking, oh, I'm going to do a painting on monuments or the feminist body. It's discovering some sort of process in the studio that then impels me to basically turn it into something, see what it speaks to from a larger standpoint. So a lot of the things in these paintings, particularly this blue half bowl shape, have to do with a lot of hand moves that are nothing is done with the brush. So padding, staining, touching, scraping, anything but this kind of authoritative mark made by a brush or a so-called recognizable mark. As Lynn mentioned in her introduction, I've spent many years doing graphic design for both commercially and for activism. So there's this element in this work that's always about design and riding this narrow, if it's even existent anymore, sort of zone between like, what is painting, what is design, how do these things operate? And here, this sort of pile up of forms is wedged inside this rectangle. This title, Damn Everything But the Circus, is based on a Sister Carita quote and a whole series of works that she did. And I was fortunate enough to have a show up at the Tang in Saratoga Springs in conjunction with the retrospective of Carita's prints. Sister Carita was this Catholic nun who made sort of radical graphics during the 60s and then turned into a kind of much beloved graphic designer. In fact, the stamp that has the love on it is a Sister Carita. So this is around 8 feet wide. I'm very interested in using the drawing as the sort of tool to keep you moving through the image. One of the things that have been fascinated by in terms of painting is how do we create an image that seems like it just showed up. So in other words, one doesn't go, oh, well that came first and then that came second. It's like there's a kind of inevitability about what the picture looks like. This is a painting from 2012, Pirate Jenny, which is the name of my show at the Tang, and which is traveling this year to Columbus, Ohio, and then to Savannah, Georgia. What's different about this, in a way, back to this one for a second, there's a sort of transition with the black. The black here is this kind of linear element. Here, it becomes a sort of structure for the painting. And somehow, when I start the work, it's always based on these black and white collages. So the black parts, such as in this one, this sort of arc form, it becomes a kind of scaffolding that everything hangs on. And it's sort of, it has this sort of essential flatness that's like pushing things back and forward. And again, these are always on unprimed canvas. So here's the next image. A lot of the things in the paintings that are very difficult to see in person are the kind of iridescent and sort of refracted pigments that are used in these. So the whole left side of the painting has this kind of, you know, you walk from one side to the other and it sort of shifts in terms of how it picks up the light. Hair doctor. A really key part of the development of my work has been thinking about acrylic paint. When I was an undergrad, I went to Pratt, and it was the mid-'80s. Everyone was, you know, if painting was interesting at all, you still weren't using acrylic paint. You know what I mean? It's like acrylic feels like this relic from some other time or some cheesy thing that no one would deign to use. So of course we were trained to use oil paint. When I graduated, I started thinking about wanting to paint on wood because I was really interested in the structure and the sort of grain of wood. And of course oil paint would ruin that. In the interim, I've but I just sort of started inching my way into acrylic paint, mainly because of this guy named Art Guerra, who has a shop in New York where he makes his own acrylic paint. But the technology around acrylic paint, the fact that it's only been around for 50 or so years, the idea that it was used as this material for a particular kind of painting, i.e. something that doesn't have a barrier between the canvas itself and the image, is very interesting to me. So this is a long way of saying that this painting is built up in this kind of chunky way. So the circle on the right side has this kind of texture. So there's always this tension between kind of glitzy prefab, what is that, cast plastic, and the image, which has a kind of seriousness to it, I think, at least I think it does. So it's clear that these paintings are both very involved with sort of thinking about modernism, and yet somehow I'm trying to bring sort of my personal relationship with painting and with that kind of work. When I was growing up and becoming an artist, even though it was the 80s, we were very much involved with, you know, either mostly rejecting modernism. So modernism represents this kind of stability in this weird way. So it's both, I guess it was probably stifling for our teachers, but for us it was like, oh, that looks like real art. So it has this kind of aspirational quality. And in a funny way, I think one of the functions of the black in these paintings is to take you to Motherwell, to Klein, to even shapes that you might have seen in, you know, like late Picasso or something. Things that were derived from surrealist tropes. This painting has very little intervention on it. So all of these white parts are basically poured gesso, and I've, in the past 10 years or so, become very involved with printmaking, and so many of the gestures that go into these works are from printmaking. There's another one. Again, this idea about finding process in the studio, or finding ways of making an image through working in the studio. I didn't say that properly. So, for example, all of this sort of like crazy rainbow pour on the right side. Whoops. Something that just occurred, and I was like, oh, that's cool. So there's always this edge that we're walking, or I'm walking, between something being sort of cheesy and then something being very elegant and sensual and sort of delicious. Hook, line, and sinker. A lot of the work, as we start to go back in time, has more and more references to the body directly. One of the things I've been long interested in is how does one sort of claim a space of experience within abstraction? Because abstraction is such a big, it's sort of like the elephant in the room right now. Everyone's an abstract painter. In New York, that's basically mostly what you're going to see. So, given the legacy of like identity politics, ooh, my computer is talking back to me. It's 7 o'clock, everyone. There's like, so how does that kind of work, which comes from a sort of materially cued place, in other words, a sculptor like Robert Gober makes a plywood painting, or a piece of plywood that is about a glory hole in a bathroom, right? So it's like materials start to have this resonance that is attached to certain identities. How does that start to play out in painting and become just a sort of normative part of our discourse and dialogue? And I think Amy Silman is a great example of that. I haven't seen the show yet, but I know her work incredibly well. And just sort of following the legacy of what she's done with oil painting. It's like early on, the paintings had this kind of cuteness that was attached to this sort of permission that, it's like, women, girls, we're going to take on our subject. And as she's sort of gone on in her life, they've gotten this more and more kind of gravity to them. I don't know if that's inevitable because you get old, or if it's part of finding a language for certain kinds of lived experience, if that makes any sense. Here's some monotypes that I did recently. So again, these are sort of cut, this is this cut shape that I made out of plastic and printed on and just kept reusing. And there's a lot of chincolle in this. Whoops, sorry. I wanted to show you the sequence. So sort of using this dancing form that veers on, perhaps some sort of goddess or some whirling dervish or something. And then using the process of constantly sort of touching and handling the paper to come up with something. Another one. So this was a series of about 7 or 8 prints that were based on this image. And it's been interesting, long before I was a painter, I was actually a dancer and was in a car accident. So I feel like this idea about dance and movement is in the work, and I'm only now becoming sort of conscious of it. Another monoprint. So these are built up through many processes. This black shape on the outside is chincolle, so it's attached and becomes a kind of scrim that, makes a sort of theater of the image. A lot of my paintings are inspired by music. For anybody of the proper age, Hong Kong Garden was a fabulous Susie and the Banshees song. So titling becomes this kind of, it's almost like a literary exercise for me. It's like, how do I let the person into these paintings without giving away anything? It's almost like, how do you make this kind of sidebar or this other set of images that sort of exists around this? And part of this, I think, comes from writing. It's like, the more I write and the more I paint, the more I realize that these two forms of communicating are on two like separate tracks, totally. It's like, you're lucky if they get a little bit close and then they pull apart. This is a very large painting. This is also in the Tang show, Pirate Jenny. And I wanted to read a little something that I wrote about Donna Nelson. Donna Nelson is a painter that if you don't know her already, you need to look her up immediately. She will be in the biennial. She's probably in her 60s. She's been making really sort of groundbreaking work for a long time that is both about the body as it's making the painting, and the sort of processes of the paint, what the paint can do. This is something I wrote about a show she had in New York. Donna Nelson proves herself to be a skilled interrogator of painting. The fundamental questions that have dogged painters over the past century, why, what, how, are answered with a great deal of glee and impatience. By turns obstreperous, sexy, violent, and transcendental, the 6 canvases manage a kind of metaphysical backflip by using bodily experiences, both the artist's and our own, to point us inward towards the cerebral aspects of painting and its history. A couple of paintings demonstrate most fully the extent to which Nelson has converted the last 50 years of painting history into her own private mosh pit. Within the artist's parameters, abstract expressionism, arte povera, color field, and Viennese actionism are linked by their emphasis in the performative and the production of works that use scale and facture to swing between the painter's body and the viewer's. So one of the pleasures of making these paintings is this sort of visceral gesture that comes from the sort of level of handling and sort of dancing around the canvas, moving it from the floor to the wall and back again, and hoping that that becomes this kind of gesture outwards towards the viewer in a way that doesn't use the kind of this is probably the wrong word, but sort of imperial autograph quality of, you know, the signature mark, the sign. It becomes a different kind of way of connecting with the viewer that is, in a way, more tactile and less autographic. This is another recent painting. So obviously in this work, if you haven't caught this already, there's a lot of interesting little body parts, breasts, vaginas, assholes, legs, feet. And one of the things I'm quite interested in is back to this notion of identity. It's like, how do we, I don't think the sort of masculinist perspective on abstraction is completely dead yet. And so this continues to be a subject, I believe, amongst painters. And just sort of picking up on that, this is something I wrote on Louise Fishman. Last year there was a cover article on her for Art in America. This is a little bit long, so bear with me. A legendary talker, Franz Klein, was famous for saying, "Painting is like hands stuck in a mattress. This is how I felt when I went to some of your studios today. People are like this, feeling around. Klein's definition vividly conjures the image of a painter wrestling with the inert pigment in order to feel his image and bring it to life. Intensely tactile and athletic, the paintings of Louise Fishman seem to come directly from this sentiment. At 73, Fishman has spent more than 50 years pitching gestural painting up against the grid. The result is an oeuvre that is resolutely idiosyncratic and canonical at the same time. In her work, the personal is disclosed incrementally through an ever-shifting abstract language invented to express the artist's compound identity as a woman, lesbian, and a Jew. This desire to explore the empirical through non-objective painting is what makes Fishman an important frontrunner of much of the painting we see today. So to me, this feels like that kind of painting for my own history. It's like this kind of doubling. It's clearly got all these references to the female body, but it's both sort of ethereal, silly, goofy, a little bit twee, a little bit gay, just delightful. Here's another one. So, and again, this kind of punning on all of the cliches that women painters had to suffer in the 20th century, such as Georgia O'Keeffe. In fact, I remember one of my teachers at Pratt saying to me, "You paint holes because you're a woman." You know what I mean? That was not that long ago. That was like, 30 years ago, which, okay, granted, many of you are younger than 30, but still, think about it. Another painting, much more sort of overtly figural. Obviously, it's like this white, chalky material, this gesso. It's bone, it's clouds, it keeps morphing in front of us. It's called Flamethrower. So in this one, you can actually see the way that this pigment that I'm using operates, where it sort of changes. Because it's transparent, it sort of shifts as it moves over the canvas, this green piece on the top. This is, I wanted to give you a peek at how these paintings start. Although this is a project I did for Bomb magazine. So the collages are much more blitzed out than they normally are. Normally they're just like a shitty little black and white piece of paper. But so this is how these paintings start. And they're always, I'm interested in just getting it's almost like putting the first parts of a building up and then putting this away. Because after I've drawn in some of the forms, it's totally not of any use to me anymore. And then the thing sort of takes on a life of its own. I don't think I've talked about Frankenthaler yet. As you notice, there's, been a consistent interest in pouring and sort of the viscous nature of acrylic paint and what it does on the canvas. Frankenthaler was, by some lights, the first color field painter. She was a student at Bennington College, where she met Clement Greenberg. And she becomes this interesting figure that there was just a show at Gagosian of her work from the late 40s. And the paintings are incredibly gnarly. Again, like Georgia O'Keeffe, she has become this figure of this kind of elegant, like sanitary napkins paintings. You know what I mean? It's like pink, green, pale. So one of the things that she talks about a lot is this idea of having things sort of appear in the painting. In other words, the story of how the painting got made is irrelevant. It's like this sort of, it's almost, divination or something. So this somehow spoke to me on that. It's another painting from this group. And as you notice, sort of the further back I go into my own history, the more sort of severe and gray the color gets. I have a very sort of primal relationship to color, which is kind of difficult to put in words. In the early stuff that I showed you, and I might go back to it, it's like I was really, really influenced by being in this particular landscape. I was in New Hampshire in the middle of fucking fall foliage. So it's like orange and gold and red and bright blue sky. So this like amazing synergy between these cool and hot colors. Here I'm thinking about this, I don't know, I was looking at a lot of images of warriors and sort of tribal masks. And this part of the work, I was really interested in developing a kind of abstraction that was based on the figure, but not explicitly figurative. So I looked at a lot of sculpture like the Venus of Willendorf, or photographs of, something is beeping up here. Uh-oh. It's the National Security Association. Anyway, where was I? Oh, thinking about shapes, thinking about abstraction and figuration that wasn't directly figurative. Anyway, here are these henchmen ready to take you away. Another sort of somber, weird, psycho painting from this time. So I always am interested in this place in the painting where the sort of color relationships become so vibratory that you're like, oh, ah. So in this one it becomes kind of literal, this, this form that sits in the middle. Ballet mécanique. So again, this whole shape on the top is one iridescent pore. I think one of the things that interests me about color field painting, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it and looking at it, is again, it's like, and this is something I've talked to a lot of you about today in your studios, it's like, is abstract expressionism is it a language, or is it about like putting your feeling on a canvas, right? So it's like this color field painting, we associate it with being kind of intuitive. It's like poured paint, and you look at a Morris Louis and the paint just seems to sort of go wherever he wants it to. These are acts of great control. This is not about showing someone that you're having a feeling. This is about using a particular language to get across a set of ideas. And I think that's one of the things that is really important for us to think about when we're in the studio. And it doesn't make the experience or the work any less authentic. What it means is that you understand in the way that a writer would what your tools are, what your materials are, and how they can be used to convey a new set of information that's particular to you. I just want to read this little thing I wrote about Jack Whitten, who's also a really amazing artist who's getting his due now. He was very, very innovative in the 70s. One of the few Black abstract artists who showed consistently. So So this is from a review I did of a show of his about 10 years ago. Acrylic paint is a relative newcomer to the ever-expanding roster of materials created, loved, and abandoned by painters. Unlike the history of oil paint, which spans over 600 years of discoveries and refinements by countless individual artists and chemists until its eventual standardization and commercialization, the evolution of acrylic paint is short and fairly well known. Formulated by Len Beaucourt and Sam Golden in the late 40s, pigments suspended in acrylic polymer emulsions set the stage for specific conceptual and formal advancements of color field artists and for late modernism in general. And this work continues, right? And it continues in the work of someone like Wade Guyton, who's using a printing press, and the sort of legacy of op art and all that other stuff. Here's some scary figures that are based on wanting to find avatars within sort of prehistoric art. I spent a lot of time in the Met during this period looking at early pottery, Jomon pottery, sculpture. And part of it was thinking about how, where was my, I had this very intense consciousness about being a female artist, yet in the history of painting, even within the feminist art movement, painting is treated as a sort of patriarchal endeavor. So it's like, how do I find my way into that conversation? Which is both addressing the notion of the canon and trying to come up with something new, actually. And also just make space for painting within that. Because if you think about it, a lot of work that has social content around women and the sort of politics of being female in this culture or any other culture often appear in photography, video, installation. So I'm using this moment in this work to sort of reimagine what painting would look like if it had been sort of included in this feminist art movement that happened in the 70s. And so a lot of discussion was around, what is our prehistory? Were there, were we painting in the caves next to the men who were painting in the caves? And it's kind of this imagined feminist take on the birth of painting, I guess you would say. This is a really important painting for me. It's called The Stone Age. Again, sort of reiterating what I just said, talking about, so at the time I was looking at a lot of cave painting and thinking about the kind of legacy that we're raised with in terms of who belongs where and in what stream of history. And even this kind of recuperation of craft and, painters that don't fit into the canon, that binary still exists, even though obviously it's changing and there's the Museum of Art and Design and blah, blah, blah. But that binary still lives in painting. In painting's cold heart, it's still there. Another painting from this series. So this was kind of like my breakout moment in terms of showing in New York. My show was up during the WAC show, which was about the history of the feminist art movement. And so the timing was very interesting, and it seemed to be in dialogue with something that was happening out in the world. Couple more paintings from this series. So this idea of, again, back to the symmetry, back to the body, back to this notion of figure and ground constantly sort of erasing each other or intermingling, back to the notion of the narrative of where, who's, what, where, at what time, all starts to bubble up in this period of the work. And you can see the use of abstraction becomes more explicit in a way. Because I was really, you know, being a bit younger than I am now. It's like, do you get my point? Get it, get it, get it, get it, get it? You know, so there's this kind of insistence on both being explicit and creating this sort of symbolic system within the work. Okay, this is another important painting. Queen Bee, again, thinking about taste, thinking about what the pouring does when it's not necessarily only attached to abstraction, and the idea of the kind of flatness that comes with that. So most of the paintings I'm going to show you now are talking or trying to think about a way to figure out how we use abstraction to show political content. This painting, for instance, is something I did a whole series of works, I'm only showing a couple right now, based on looking at Russian constructivism and what are the mandates of Russian constructivism. For example, this idea of this sort of megaphone that lives above everything else, you know, that goes to like Tatlin's monument to the Third International, to actual sort of gramophones that are coming into being. So the machine, what does the machine look like inside an abstract painting? Another painting from this series. These are paintings that are sort of like transitional paintings. This pile up of imagery that I had collected over the years. I was actually using projector to paint most of these pictures with. So in fact, the relationship between the hard edge, the opacity, the pour was all much more manufactured than it is in later work. And part of this subject and thinking about sort of the iconography of the left or the iconography of culture when I was first becoming an artist, you know, when I was an adolescent, was sort of thinking about things that one doesn't normally put in a painting. And you know, it's like images from a poster or logos, and there will be more of that as we go along here. Whoops, sorry. A lot of these take very specific things in art. For example, this title is the title from a situationist named Constant, who was working in the 50s, and thinking about how situationism, again, it's like this kind of struggle between the immediacy of the street, graphics, and what happens when these things are brought back into the studio. Does it become a kind of primer for political imagery, or does it just, you know, look like IKEA furniture or something? It's like, where does modernism sit here? A couple more of these images. Again, this idea of printmaking, the white surface as being this light source. these are much more sort of overt hybrids of things that are known. For example, this thing on the right is this logo from May '68, which was part of the Situationist movement, Atelier Populaire, and then the rest of it is from a Rodchenko painting. So part of the work, even though it perhaps feels obscure, is this kind of testing the viewer to find these clues about art history and source material. Another painting from the series. A lot of the imagery in this group of paintings comes from my own history. When I was a teenager, I hung around this like free cinema in my little town in Corvallis, Oregon, where they were handing out copies of the Little Red Book and different sorts of like communist propaganda. And I was like, wow, this is so cool. What is this? And so this kind of legacy of looking at these graphics and looking at how ephemeral they are and having, you know, random pieces of newspaper shoved all over your house is part of what's going on in here. There's Lenin, Marx, and Chairman Mao, who's covered up by that big piece of blood in this picture. So it's like in these early pictures, you can see how the pour acts as this form that sort of casts ambiguity on things that are clearly sort of textual, such as the, you know, Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome and the Tatlin monument on the upper right. Another painting with the fathers of communism. So now I'm showing you really, really early things. These are paintings from grad school that I did when I was at Bard. And, you know, I don't know what to say about this. I'm just kind of showing it to you. I'm like, oh my God, I'm looking at that at like 10 feet tall. I'm being very revealing here, like this. I did a series of paintings called yantras, this idea of making these small paintings to meditate on. And at this point, I'm more interested in collaging items into the image than actually painting them. So you start to see that some of the iconography in this work has an actual material basis. So the centerpiece is taken from an Indian poster that I found in my neighborhood, and then there's all sorts of things attached to this string, and the zigzag man, very important cultural icon. A lot of this stuff happened when I was a student at Skowhegan. I was in this environment where there were all these sort of back to the land people who just populated the land around Skowhegan, which is in Maine. And it's like, I come from, one of the reasons my family moved around a lot was because my parents were sort of bohemian hippies. And so like, what becomes of these remnants of this culture that, I mean, it's still, people are still talking about it in painting. I mean, there are all these tie-dyed paintings out in the world right now, bleached paintings, paintings of sort of, you know, sad bed sheets. So this kind of abjection about the sort of materials and signs attached to counterculture is still present, is still with us. And part of the experience of going to Skowhegan was sort of returning to the studio. And I'm going to show you now, I'm almost done, people. I had a big hiatus where I stopped painting for like 6 years because I decided painting was too bourgeois and I couldn't do it. I couldn't justify it. And I had the nerve of, you know, like a 25-year-old going, oh my God, I don't want my paintings in the lobby of the IBM building, as if that would happen. So, you know, these are the things you think about. It's like, what are your sort of values around painting? So this is from '86. So there's a big jump here. I was making work in the early '90s. I'm just not showing you any of it because I don't have any of it. This is stuff I made in art school at Pratt. And yeah, here's that wood panel I was talking about. If you go back and look at Carol Dunham's work from the '80s, he painted a lot on wood panel. And I was sort of in love with this idea of graffiti, and he does it. This painting is not a good example of even this thinking, but the stuff I was thinking, which is very different from the object itself, is what is this wood that seems to be this kind of vessel for all these different people? You know, maybe it's a desktop that got written on for 50 years or something. In a way, I'm sort of using it more for what it is, as this kind of abstraction of nature. And as I sort of said in the beginning, or maybe not, this idea of biomorphic abstraction has been like the thing that I wanted to make when I was, you know, decided to go to art school. It's like, how do I translate this experience of, and I don't even know if it's about sort of purity or anything. I think it's almost an interest in the forms themselves, in natural forms. Okay, so these are paintings that I made at Pratt, and you will see the influence of Lee Krasner. I was really into cutting up my paintings and sort of gluing them back together. And that's the first thing this is the first and the last thing I'm going to show you. And it kind of says it all. And if you would like to know about Dyke Action Machine, you can go on our website. I'm leaving you with lots of homework. Anyway, thank you. Thank you all. Any questions? Yes.
Thank you so much. That was great. You've talked a lot about your influences and about the art historical basis of your work. I'd like to know a little bit more about your process in the studio. Mm-hmm. For example, you've said that you sometimes work on the floor and then you move it to the wall. Do you work on stretcher bars? Do you already decide on the way your work will be cropped, or do you crop it later? And just tell us a little bit more about your tools and your process.
Okay. God, I thought I was so revealing. Normally I don't say any of this stuff, so I'm glad you said that. No, I don't paint like Morris Louis. I don't like paint by the yard and cut them off. Every painting is stretched before I make it. So I'm actually maneuvering these things that are very stiff when I'm pouring and painting. So it's almost like a big sail or something. And yeah, the image, and I think this comes from sort of my background in graphic design, is certain aspects of the image are set rather early in the painting. So it's not as if I'm sort of moving the viewfinder back and forth trying to find this place. At a risk of sounding somewhat formulaic, even though next time you hear me give a talk, it will be completely different. I'm doing something fabulous in my studio. there's always this like moment in the painting where there's a kind of like painting event. And I think, you know, Bacon is somebody who uses that strategy to ad nauseum. If you look at his work over history, it's like there's a diagram, there's a space, and then there's like an event, like it's the head explodes or something. But it's always a kind of abstract moment where the paint just does the paint thing. And they're always spectacular. So it's like, you know, it's a kind of theater. And at the risk of sounding really cheesy, I can't be interrupted when I'm painting that part. It's just like, you know, because everything's drying at the same time. So is that helpful? It depends, you know, it depends on if I'm teaching, it depends on, my problem right now is that I'm treating these like 8-foot canvases like they're these big pieces of paper, because I don't want any pentimenti on the surface. I just want this like shh. And so that means I've just like destroyed like 6 canvases last week, you know. So it's like this idea of either I'm just really anal and picky and not willing to accept what happens, which is connected to these notions of intuition and blah, 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 which painters are so fond of. Or, you know, I just need these big surfaces to practice on, you know, and maybe, you know, on the 10th one, I'll get it right or something. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, when your pirate Jenny was here a couple years ago, I kept kind of staying with it, and I couldn't escape it, so thank you for that.
Uh-huh.
And I was thinking about, in relation to your work, in relation to Freakenthaler and Earther Dove, this sort of like fluid shape, and then this also shape that's kind of pushing toward the other ones to exist. I was wondering if you could either talk about more about the shapes in your work or about shapes you like in other paintings.
Wait, say that again. Shapes or shifts?
Sorry, shapes. They're kind of pushing against each other.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, shapes. Serious business shapes. Actually, I have this sticky in my studio right now that keeps saying like weirder shapes, because, you know, one thing about paint is it's kind of predictable, sort of, I guess you'd use the term physics, maybe, like what it will do. So, yeah, I think you've sort of identified a place that I'm, I guess this is something you shouldn't admit in an artist talk, but it's like, I'm kind of up against the wall on that right now. It's like, okay, I could either make them really simple, and then they become some kind of meditation on Ellsworth Kelly or something that I'm not interested in. Or I could make them really complicated, but that's kind of boring, and I don't want to paint that. So I don't know who I was talking to today, Giovanni, I think. You know, finding this sweet spot where the thing is really, really inventive, but in a very straightforward way. And that's kind of what I'm after. I don't think I'm there right now, but that's what's in my mind. But that's a great question. Any other questions?
Hi. Could you tell us a little bit about your transition from school to the professional adult art world? I'm just curious as a student about that.
Sure. Well, I graduated from Pratt and I went and immediately got a studio in Williamsburg like I thought I should. And I had to work like 27 jobs to support it, and it was painful. And then I was like, it's so painful, I don't even know if I want to do this. So then I had this, like 5-year hiatus where I decided I'd be a graphic designer. And what ended up happening is I actually found the reason to go back to the studio, which was that and a lot of the activist art, if you look on dykeactionmachine.com, sort of finds its genesis at this time when I'm not having a studio. It's like I was way more involved with the social aspects of what was going on around me. And it felt like painting couldn't address that, which I don't feel today, but that's what it felt like at the time. But I got this urge to sort of do something that I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And so I eventually went back to having a studio. But in the meantime, this time I spent learning how to do work, work on the computer and do graphic design ended up being incredibly useful because it supported my painting for many years before I started selling work and taught and stuff like that. And it allowed me enough time to be in my studio, which is always the problem, right? So, I don't know, is that helpful? Yeah, it's really hard when you're first out of school. Very, very hard. And I don't even think it's just the fact that you don't have people to talk to, because you could start your own crit group, or there are all these ways you could do it. It's more about having that like big doubt thing, like, why am I doing this? Who cares? There are literally 500,000 painters in New York, so don't move to New York, people. It's like, and that's the hard part, I think. Another question?
Hi, Carrie. How you doing?
Hi.
I loved your talk. Can you say something about the difference in scale in your different work? Like the collages in BOM were really kind of small.
Yeah.
And the paintings, your other work is very, very, very large.
Yeah. It's the magic of Keynote. Yeah, mostly I suck at small sizes. That's just what I've come to believe now that I've been painting for 30 years or something. Except for these collages. And because I don't have any expectations for them, it's like and this is a feeling I'm trying to sort of bring to the larger paintings. It's like, do I really have to show off all the time? Like, how much is enough? All these questions that are really, you keep thinking at different stages in your career, like, oh, I got that. I figured that one out. It feels like it's coming up again. So it's like, what is really necessary for the image? Does it need to be, like one of my goals in the past was to make something where, like, if you had it at the end of your bed and you woke up in the morning, you could find something new in it every day. You know what I mean? And so this idea that there's this kind of shifting, destabilized space, to me required like a big size, So I've tended to like big sizes, also because I can't overwork them as quickly. But yeah, the prints are small, the collages are small, Some of the early paintings are about 24 inches, but mostly the work is around 6, 7 feet. Anybody else?
One more? Okay, one more. This is it.
Eduardo.
Hi, Carrie.
Hi.
I wasn't sure if I was trying to really make sense of this question before I asked it, and so that's why I hesitated till the end. But I hope I make sense. I'm also not really a painter, and so that's another part of my hesitation. But here it goes. At some point in your talk, you mentioned that you were interested in whether there's room for the experience of the body within abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout it, I felt like in the case of your work, that can sort of like be found in the suggestion of, through shapes, and you mentioned Moffat for that some reason.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just curious if there were other places where you can situate that, the subject position and all this other stuff, or if your alternative writing and activist practice just carries the weight of your politics, leaving your paintings free of that, or...
Yeah. Well, that is the, $2 million question, or whatever the number is. I think, part of the reason that I did the talk this way today is because I think I am very left brain, and so, to me, if I do a project for activism, or I do a writing, a text or an essay for someone, somehow that has a sort of concreteness of ideas. And often when I'm painting, and this is why I like painting, but it's like, it's like, where exactly do you locate that? Is it political because the sort of number of women painters has only been half since the last 40 years? Is it because it uses certain imagery? Is it because it sort of playfully deconstructs certain canonical ideas? You know what I mean? And sometimes those feel very academic, not when I'm painting, but when I'm up here talking about it. And so, and I think I come from a generation that privileges work that's more didactic, actually. Like, I grew up in postmodernism, so it's like, okay, let's get to the point. But on the other hand, that's not interesting to make that for me. So, and I don't, this is a terrible answer, but it's true. I have so many different thoughts about this. They're very complicated. Does that answer your question? Not really. I mean, the subject position in the painting is the thing I thought of when you said that is I've often had people tell me they wanted to lick my paintings. And that is how I will end the talk.